The year was 285 BC, and Egypt stood at the height of its Hellenistic transformation. The marble corridors of Alexandria's royal palace shimmered beneath the Mediterranean sun, echoing with the footsteps of philosophers, generals, governors, and spies. But behind its brilliant facade, the Ptolemaic dynasty hid a secret darker than any myth whispered among the city's bustling streets. It was here that a young princess named Arsinoe, barely in her early adolescence, first stepped into a world where political power mattered more than morality, and family boundaries meant nothing in the pursuit of absolute rule. Arsinoe II was born into a dynasty that believed itself divine. Her father, Ptolemaic II, was no ordinary king. He had once fought beside Alexander the Great, marched across Persia, stormed ancient cities, and carved his name into history. After Alexander's death in 323 BC, Ptolemy seized Egypt, declaring himself its rightful guardian. Over time, he laid the foundation for a new royal line, one that fused Greek ambition with ancient Egyptian religious tradition. He wrapped himself in the identity of a pharaoh, claiming descent from the gods, and he expected his children to follow suit. In the royal palace, Arsinoe and her siblings were raised amid a culture very different from traditional Greek values. Egypt, for thousands of years, had accepted sibling marriages among pharaohs as a symbol of divine purity. The gods Isis and Osiris themselves were believed to be both siblings and spouses. To Egyptians, such unions represented sacred unity, a continuation of divine cosmic order. But to the Greeks, especially those from Athens and Macedonia, such marriages were abhorrent. For them, it crossed boundaries of morality, law, and nature. Yet the Ptolemies were no ordinary Greeks. They were rulers. Their legitimacy depended on appearing more Egyptian than the Egyptians themselves, and more divine than the gods. Arsinoe's life, from its earliest years, was shaped by this dual identity. Greek blood flowed through her veins, but Egyptian ideology dictated her destiny. She was raised not just to be a daughter of Egypt, but to be a symbol of royal power. By the age of 15 or 16, Arsinoe had already become known for her intelligence, ambition, and political sharpness. Ancient writers described her as a woman of remarkable authority and charisma. Unlike many Greek noblewomen of her time, she received a royal education that included philosophy, politics, languages, and religion. She grew up watching her father manipulate allies, crush rebellions, negotiate alliances, and build a dynasty that would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. But with power came danger. When Ptolemy began planning the future of his kingdom, he understood one thing clearly: only absolute loyalty could secure the dynasty. Trusting outsiders was risky. Greek generals had betrayed one another for power after Alexander's death. Alliances shifted every year. To maintain stability, Ptolemy needed a family so tightly bound that betrayal became impossible. And so he turned to a method that Egyptian pharaohs had used for generations. He turned inward. In 285 BC, the political landscape changed dramatically. Ptolemy was aging, and enemies of Egypt were growing. Macedonia, Seleucid Persia, and Caria all had their eyes on Egyptian wealth. To secure the throne, the old king made a shocking decision that historians still debate today. He arranged for Arsinoe II to enter a dynastic marriage that broke Greek taboos, but aligned perfectly with ancient Egyptian royal tradition. Arsinoe was to be married into her own family. Some ancient sources suggest the first arrangement was to marry her half-brother, Ptolemy Koronos, a violent, unpredictable man who would later become one of the most feared rulers in Greek history. But behind this political arrangement stood a far more disturbing shadow. According to several ancient accounts, Ptolemy shaped his daughter's political life in ways that blurred the line between paternal authority and the forced dynastic practices used to maintain royal purity. To strengthen the claim of divine rule, Arsinoe was pushed toward the kind of internal unions designed to elevate the family to godlike status. For Arsinoe, there was no room for refusal. She lived in a world where royal women were tools of diplomacy, symbols of power, sacrifices for political stability. Her marriage was not her choice. It was her duty. It was her destiny. As her father prepared to abdicate, the palace was filled with tension. Rival factions battled for influence. Generals whispered in the corridors. Advisors plotted against each other. And Arsinoe, barely a teenager, was thrust into the center of it all. Her father's obsession with consolidating power meant that her body, her lineage, and her future were now weapons to be used in a dynasty that believed itself chosen by the gods. When Ptolemy finally placed the royal diadem on the head of her brother, Ptolemy II, Arsinoe's role in the dynasty became even more important. She was no longer simply a daughter of a king. She was now the sister of a pharaoh, a political figure whose alliances could determine the fate of Egypt. And her father's expectations weighed heavily on her. To preserve the purity of the royal bloodline and maintain divine legitimacy, Arsinoe would be bound not to a foreign prince or a Greek nobleman, but to someone far closer, someone within her own family. Thus began the tale of a queen whose life would be shaped by a dynasty that valued legitimacy over morality, power over boundaries, and divine purity over human freedom. Arsinoe's story was about to unfold in ways that would shock the ancient world, destroy kingdoms, ignite wars, and redefine the meaning of royal authority in Egypt. Her fate, sealed by her father's ambition, would transform her into one of the most controversial queens in ancient history. And this was only the beginning. By the time Arsinoe II reached adulthood in the final years of the 4th century BC, the foundations of her destiny had already been laid. Her father, Ptolemy I, had spent decades cultivating a dynasty that fused Greek ambition with Egyptian divinity. He was determined that his children and grandchildren would appear as living gods, rulers whose power came not from blood alone, but from sacred legitimacy crafted through marriage, religion, and controlled lineage. Arsinoe grew up watching the palace transform into a center of both brilliance and deception. Alexandria was the jewel of the Mediterranean, home to the great library, the lighthouse, and philosophers from every corner of the Greek world. It was a city where mathematics, astronomy, poetry, and politics mixed with espionage, propaganda, and bloodshed. Every corner whispered of alliances, betrayals, trade wars, and shifting loyalties among the successors of Alexander the Great. Her father's dream was simple, a dynasty so unified that no outsider could ever threaten Egypt. But the method he chose was one the Greeks would later condemn as unnatural. He constructed a system that encouraged marriages within the royal bloodline, a practice that Egyptians associated with the gods. For Egyptians, a king who married his sister mirrored the divine union of Isis and Osiris. For Ptolemy I, this symbolism was political gold. It gave his children a sacred aura. It made them untouchable, yet it also trapped them. Arsinoe's first marriage came when she was still very young. Her father arranged a union with a powerful Macedonian general, Lysimachus, ruler of Thrace and Macedon. This was a political chess move intended to strengthen ties with another major power. Lysimachus was decades older than her, a war-hardened commander who had fought under Alexander and survived the brutal wars of the Diadochi. Arsinoe left Egypt for his court, stepping into a new world filled with intrigue. There her intelligence quickly shone. She learned the politics of the Thracian kingdom, managed affairs of the court, and even influenced the succession of Lysimachus's heirs. But this marriage would not last. A growing rivalry between the Hellenistic kingdoms triggered conflicts that entangled Arsinoe in a web of betrayal. When her stepson Agathocles was executed, possibly on her influence, but more likely by the political machinations of the court, the kingdom spiraled into chaos. It did not take long for the fragile alliance between Thrace and Egypt to crumble. Lysimachus went to war against Seleucus, ruler of the vast Seleucid Empire. The battle that followed in 281 BC cost him his life, forcing Arsinoe to flee with her children for safety. Seleucus attempted to seize her, perhaps as a political trophy, but she escaped again, this time to the city of Cassandreia. This was the moment she encountered one of the most dangerous men in Greek history, her half-brother, Ptolemy Koronos. Koronos had once been a potential successor in Egypt, but his violence, ambition, and unpredictability had made him a threat to the stability Ptolemy I desired. The old king had exiled him. Now, in exile, Koronos returned with a vengeance. He plotted to seize power in Macedon, and marrying Arsinoe presented him with an opportunity. A marriage between siblings was recognized in Egypt, but forbidden and shocking to Macedonians. Still, Koronos used the language of divine royalty to justify the union. He promised Arsinoe protection, stability, and power. She hesitated, but political survival demanded difficult choices. And so, in a fragile moment of fear and uncertainty, Arsinoe entered a union with Koronos. Yet within months she learned the truth. This marriage was not a partnership, but a trap. Koronos murdered her 2 younger sons in a calculated move to eliminate rivals to the Macedonian throne. Arsinoe barely escaped with her life, fleeing to the island of Samothrace. This moment broke something inside her. She had learned that marriage among royals was rarely personal. It was a tool, a cage, a weapon, but she was not the type to surrender to fate. She was a survivor, and she would soon return to Egypt, determined to reclaim power. Her return to Alexandria marked the beginning of the most controversial chapter of her life. Her brother, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, now sat on the throne. He carried forward their father's legacy of blending Greek governance with Egyptian divine kingship. But he needed something more than military strength. He needed religious and symbolic authority. His wife, Arsinoe I, was of noble lineage, but lacked the divine aura that Egyptian royal ideology required. Arsinoe II arrived at a perfect moment. She was a daughter of Ptolemy I, a woman with political experience, intelligence, and royal blood. She was a survivor who had escaped wars, assassinations, and betrayals. Her presence gave the dynasty legitimacy and continuity. Ptolemy II saw an opportunity, and so, in a move that stunned the Greek world, he set aside his existing wife and took Arsinoe II as his new queen. The Greeks recoiled in shock. To them, such a union was immoral, even monstrous. But to the Egyptians, the marriage carried divine symbolism. It portrayed them as the living embodiment of Isis and Osiris, a sacred pair ruling together in eternal harmony. This was not a marriage of passion, it was a marriage of power. Arsinoe, now queen once more, used her new role to wield influence unlike any other woman of her era. Despite the controversy in Greece, Egypt embraced her. She was celebrated as a goddess in her lifetime. Her image appeared on coins beside her brothers. Temples honored her with titles once reserved for deities. She helped shape policies, trade networks, and diplomatic alliances. She became not only a queen, but a political architect of the Ptolemaic state. But behind the grandeur lay an undeniable truth. The marriage that defined her legacy was not her choice. It was a product of the ideology created by her father, a system where royal women were instruments of divine politics, symbols of purity, and tools of legitimacy. Ptolemy I had built a dynasty dependent on internal marriage to sustain its power. His daughter became both the embodiment and the victim of that system. Arsinoe II's life was a tapestry woven from ambition, survival, dynasty, and sacrifice. Her father's decisions, rooted in political strategy, shaped her fate long after his death. She had endured forced alliances, dangerous unions, and the pressure of divine kingship. Yet she had risen above them all to become one of the most powerful queens in ancient history. The path ahead, however, would bring even greater influence, deeper controversy, and consequences that reshaped Egypt for generations. When Arsinoe II returned to Egypt after surviving betrayal and exile, few could have predicted the transformation that awaited her. The year was around 276 BC, and Alexandria, radiant in marble and intellect, stood as the beating heart of the Mediterranean world. The city buzzed with scholars, merchants, envoys, and priests, all maneuvering for influence under the watchful eye of the Ptolemaic throne. It was into this world that Arsinoe stepped once more, this time not as a vulnerable refugee, but as a woman hardened by loss and sharpened by political warfare. Her brother, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, welcomed her with more than familial affection. He saw in her a partner, a co-ruler, a symbol of continuity that the dynasty desperately needed. His rule was strong, but not unquestioned. Greek critics accused him of softness, extravagance, and being overly influenced by court factions. Foreign powers sought opportunities to weaken Egypt. The Seleucids, led by Antiochus I, eyed the Levant with growing ambition. Moreover, the internal Greek population in Egypt, though prosperous, still resisted fully embracing Egyptian traditions. Arsinoe II brought something no general or philosopher could offer. She brought legitimacy. She brought the aura of a survivor. She carried the legacy of their father, Ptolemy I, and the sacred image of divine lineage. Her presence alone stabilized the court. Her intelligence made her invaluable, but it was her symbolic power that transformed her into a figure greater than any queen of her age. Her rise began quietly, through subtle acts of diplomacy and influence. She cultivated relationships with priests and temple elites, understanding deeply that in Egypt, royal power was inseparable from religious authority. She restored shrines, funded rituals, and ensured that her image was linked with the goddess Isis, the mother figure of Egypt's divine mythology. She appeared in public adorned in Egyptian regalia, adopting titles that bridged the gap between Greek and Egyptian traditions. Gradually, she became the living embodiment of the dynasty's divine mission. Coins minted during this period show Arsinoe with the horn of Ammon, a symbol associated with divinity. She was depicted with diadem and veil, representing both her royal status and her sacred identity. Her name was invoked in prayers. Her portraits were carried in public processions. The Ptolemaic cult began elevating her as a goddess even in her lifetime. This was unprecedented for a Hellenistic queen. But to achieve this power, she made a choice that shocked the Greek world and forever defined her legacy. She agreed to marry her brother, Ptolemy II. Greek historians such as Theocritus and later Roman writers would condemn the union, calling it unnatural and immoral. They accused the Ptolemies of violating the customs of the civilized world, but their criticism overlooked a crucial truth. Arsinoe was not driven by desire. She was driven by survival and political strategy. This marriage offered her a position no other woman in Egypt could achieve. It made her not only queen, but co-ruler. It allowed her to wield influence over domestic policies, religious reforms, foreign affairs, and internal security. The effects of this union stretched across Egypt and beyond. Under Arsinoe's guidance, Egypt expanded its maritime influence. She oversaw the strengthening of trade networks across the Aegean Sea. She supported naval expeditions that secured islands vital for Egyptian commerce. She worked closely with mercenaries and local governors, ensuring that the Ptolemaic navy remained unmatched in the eastern Mediterranean. She also developed a network of loyal administrators who owed their positions to her personal influence. These individuals helped her manage tax systems, temple finances, and local governance. In several inscriptions, her name appears beside that of Ptolemy II, indicating her role as a co-regent rather than a ceremonial figure. Her influence extended into foreign diplomacy as well. When Egypt entered conflict with the Seleucid Empire in what became known as the First Syrian War, Arsinoe's hand in strategy was unmistakable. She pushed for alliances with Greek island states, using her prestige and diplomatic skills to secure cooperation. Egypt's victory in key battles during this period was partly attributed to her strategic planning and her ability to unite Greek and Egyptian factions under a common goal. But perhaps her most powerful achievement was the creation of the cult of Arsinoe Philadelphus. After her marriage to the king, priests and poets began depicting Arsinoe as a divine queen whose spirit guided the nation. Temples were dedicated in her name. Her images appeared beside those of deities. Even after her death, sailors prayed to her for protection at sea. This transformation into a divine protector made her influence extend far beyond her lifetime. Yet beneath the public glory, political tensions continued. The dismissal of Ptolemy II's previous wife, Arsinoe I, had created enemies. Some factions at court saw Arsinoe II as an outsider manipulating the king. Aristocrats resented her power. Greek intellectuals attacked her marriage as a distortion of Greek tradition. Foreign rulers feared her growing influence over Egypt's military and economy. Arsinoe responded to these criticisms not with brutality, but with cleverness. She sponsored plays, poetry, and historical works that celebrated her achievements. She invited scholars to the royal court, integrating their ideas into state propaganda. She ensured that the Library of Alexandria favored writings that legitimized her marriage through ancient Egyptian tradition rather than Greek custom. She understood that ideas could conquer more lands than armies. This intellectual diplomacy made her the most celebrated queen of her age. Even critics acknowledged her intelligence and charisma. The poet Callimachus wrote hymns in her honor. Scholars at the library studied her lineage and compared her to the greatest women of myth. Her fame spread to Athens, Sparta, and the islands of the Aegean, but the glory of her reign was not to last indefinitely. In 270 BCE, after years of shaping the kingdom, Arsinoe II died unexpectedly. The grief that swept through Alexandria was immense. Ptolemy II declared a period of mourning throughout Egypt. Priests conducted rituals praising her as a divine being. Her cult grew even larger after her death, spreading into Greece and the Aegean. Inscriptions honored her as a goddess of prosperity, protection, and royal virtue. Strangely, in death she wielded even more influence than she had in life. Her divine cult became a symbol of the Ptolemaic dynasty's legitimacy. Rulers after Ptolemy II used her image to reinforce their own authority. Her deification allowed Egypt to promote the idea that its rulers were chosen by the gods and guided by divine wisdom. Arsinoe II had entered history as a daughter of a king, survived as a queen of two kingdoms, and departed the world as a goddess of a vast empire. Her life was shaped by forces beyond her control. Yet through intelligence, resilience, and political brilliance, she transformed a fate imposed upon her into a legacy that would influence generations. She became more than a queen subjected to the demands of dynasty. She became a symbol of royal power, divine authority, and strategic brilliance. Her story, however, does not end here. The consequences of her life and marriage began to reshape Egypt in ways no one expected. What followed next would determine the future of the entire Ptolemaic dynasty and set the stage for centuries of political intrigue, divine kingship, and the eventual rise of one of history's most famous queens. When Arsinoe II died in 270 BC, the silence in the palace was unlike anything Alexandria had ever felt. It was not simply the death of a queen. It was the end of a political force whose influence was woven directly into the fabric of the kingdom. The marble halls, accustomed to the echo of her sharp commands and measured steps, now carried only the whispers of attendants and the hushed grief of courtiers. But the true power of Arsinoe would only begin after her passing. Her legacy was not meant to fade. It was meant to shape history. Ptolemy II, devastated by the loss, initiated one of the most ambitious royal commemorations in the ancient world. He elevated Arsinoe to divine status, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a formal religious institution. Inscriptions across Egypt and the Greek world announced her as a goddess. Sailors invoked her for protection at sea. Farmers prayed to her for fertility and harvest. Temples adopted new rituals in her name. Even cities beyond Egyptian borders integrated her cult into local traditions. This sudden rise of a queen into a deity may seem extraordinary, but it was carefully engineered. The Ptolemaic dynasty understood the power of religion. They knew that a divine queen gave moral and symbolic legitimacy to the throne. By transforming Arsinoe II into a goddess, Ptolemy II ensured that her authority continued to legitimize future rulers long after her mortal life had ended. One of the most striking symbols of her cult was the creation of the shrine of Arsinoe Philadelphus, located near harbors and major trade routes. Its design allowed travelers and sailors to honor her before departing on journeys. The shrine was not simply an act of devotion. It was political brilliance. As Egyptian ships sailed across the Mediterranean, the cult of Arsinoe spread with them. Her name reached Rhodes, Delos, Cyprus, and even mainland Greece. The message was clear. Egypt was not merely a kingdom. It was a power endorsed by the gods. This divine association inspired Ptolemy II to rename several towns and military units in her honor. Naval squadrons bore her name, and religious festivals celebrated her as a protector of the seas. In an era where maritime trade determined a kingdom's strength, this association made Egypt's influence stretch even further. But the consequences of Arsinoe's legacy went beyond religion. Her marriage to her brother, a union rooted in the ideology crafted by their father, became the blueprint for future Ptolemaic rulers. After Arsinoe II, nearly every major Ptolemaic king married a sibling, cousin, or close family member. This practice, shocking to outsiders, soon became the defining feature of the dynasty. Greek historians criticized it relentlessly, but Egyptian priests embraced it. For them, these marriages represented divine harmony. This shift had a profound effect on the political landscape. Royal marriages could no longer be used to form alliances with foreign kingdoms. Instead, the dynasty turned inward, consolidating power through internal unions. This strategy kept the royal bloodline tightly controlled, but it also isolated the dynasty from foreign diplomatic networks. While Egyptian rulers maintained strong military and economic presence, their relationships with other Greek powers became increasingly tense. Arsinoe's divine legacy also influenced the cultural and intellectual aspects of Egypt. Scholars in the Library of Alexandria used her life as a subject for poetry, philosophy, and political analysis. Writers such as Callimachus, Xenodotus, and other court intellectuals wove her story into works that portrayed her as a symbol of strength, intelligence, and royal virtue. These writings shaped how future generations understood the role of queenship in the Hellenistic world. Her image on coins continued long after her death, a rare honor. Most queens were erased from history by the time their husbands died. Arsinoe, on the other hand, appeared side by side with Ptolemy II in state iconography for decades. This visual presence ensured her memory remained embedded in the daily lives of Egyptians. Every merchant who touched a coin, every sailor who prayed to her image, every priest who recited her name, all contributed to the immortality of her legacy. Yet perhaps the most significant impact of Arsinoe II was the example she set for future Ptolemaic queens. For nearly 2 centuries, her legacy would echo through the lives of royal women like Cleopatra II, Cleopatra III, and eventually Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt. These queens inherited Arsinoe's political model, using their intelligence, diplomatic skill, and public influence to shape policy and command armies. Without Arsinoe II, the rise of Cleopatra VII would have been nearly impossible. Cleopatra VII, who would meet Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony, adopted many strategies that Arsinoe had pioneered. She used religion as political power. She cultivated intellectual networks. She ruled as a co-regent. She presented herself not just as a queen, but as a divine symbol. These methods were not innovations of Cleopatra alone. They were foundations laid by Arsinoe II, who had mastered the art of blending Greek and Egyptian traditions into a unified identity. But the Ptolemaic model of sibling marriage, though politically useful, came with tragic consequences. Over generations, genetic isolation weakened the dynasty. Internal betrayals grew more frequent. Sibling rivalries escalated into deadly conflicts. The dynasty that Arsinoe helped strengthen eventually fractured under the weight of its own design. Her influence did not end at Egypt's borders. Throughout the Hellenistic world, Arsinoe became a subject of fascination, praise, and sometimes condemnation. Greek philosophers debated the ethics of her marriage. Historians analyzed her political choices. Playwrights referenced her divine cult. Her story symbolized the cultural clash between Greek tradition and Egyptian religious ideology. European scholars centuries later would rediscover her inscriptions and analyze her role in shaping the ancient world. Even today, historians consider her one of the most influential women of antiquity. Despite the controversies that surrounded her life, Arsinoe II did not seek to break norms for their own sake. She did so because survival demanded it. From a young age, she had been thrust into political storms, married into unstable kingdoms, betrayed by those she trusted, and forced into alliances that went against her own agency. Yet she rose from each crisis stronger, more strategic, and more determined. Her father's political system may have shaped her fate, but Arsinoe reshaped that system in return. She took a role designed to confine her and transformed it into a platform for authority. She turned a controversial marriage into a tool of legitimacy. She transformed divine symbolism into a political weapon. She forged her name into history not as a victim, but as a ruler who understood power in a world where survival required brilliance. In the end, Arsinoe II stood at the crossroads of culture, politics, and identity. She bridged Greek rationality and Egyptian spirituality, turning two worlds into one dynasty. Her life, marked by forced alliances and dangerous choices, became a blueprint for the most iconic queens who followed her. Her story reminds us that history is often shaped not by those who choose their destiny, but by those who rise above the destiny forced upon them. Arsinoe II, the queen molded by circumstance, became a goddess who defined an empire.